Yes, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Bhate. Uh, he retired from Department of Mathematics, Savitribai Phule Pune University, Pune. Now he is working as a Professor Emeritus at Department of Mathematics, Savitribai Phule Pune University. His primary research areas are differential equation and analysis, I can say. And now he shifted to geometric group theory and also parts of graph theory. And the very significant thing is his a former student, PhD student, Asif Sheikh, recently received the Fulbright Fellowship, and who is going to speak tomorrow at the same time for next two lectures. With this brief introduction, I request Professor Bhate to deliver his talk. Over to you, sir.
Okay, thank you, Professor Joshi. And it's always nice to give talks in refresher courses, and it's also nice to see new faces on the one hand, and also to see faces who are whom one sort of had seen 15 years ago and see how they have changed in the last 15 years. So there are quite a few people whom I am seeing now after the time when they finished their MScs in the department, and it's good to see them again 15 years or 10 years after they have finished their MSc. So I'd like to thank the department and Professor Joshi for giving me this chance to talk a little bit about this area. And you will see that there are, in fact, connections to quite a few things that people had talked about over the last 10 days in what I'm going to talk about today. Okay, it's sort of an area which sort of intersects with quite a few subjects, not just in mathematics, but also it turns out that even physicists today are interested in talking about zeta functions for graphs, because apparently they arise in some way in high energy physics or string theory and things like that. So I don't really know how they arise, and I must also confess that it is not that I am in any way an expert in this area, but this is something that Professor Sheikh and I had started looking at, and some nice topics and pictures came out of it. So this is also part of this, it turns out that this last 4 or 5 lectures in this refresher course are all related to each other. What yesterday Professor Nimborkar had talked about this zigzag products and expander graphs, and this is related to the zeta functions on graphs, and it's also related to what Professor Sheikh will talk about tomorrow and day after. So there's sort of very nice areas of mathematics that are covered in this thing. And as I said, this is also related to what Professor Krishnan had talked about this theorems of Bapat and Pati and other people, and Q Laplacian and things like that. It turns out that we are talking about a Q Laplacian, which is exactly the same thing that Krishnan had talked about, Shivagrama-Krishnan had talked about 2-3 days ago. So in fact, one of the theorems that he mentioned follows from what we're talking about here. Okay, so before, without wasting too much time, by the way, I hope that all of you have got these notes. I think Professor Joshi had sent them to you 2 days ago. And I hope you have had the time to have a look at them. So as usual, if there are any questions or difficulties about my notation, or sometimes my handwriting is not quite read in the way that it is supposed to be read. And that's why in the abstract that was sent to you, there are some, whether you call them misprints or misinterpretations of what I had written is debatable. So there's some things in that abstract which are not quite correct, but the idea is all there. Okay, so if there are any questions, do please interrupt me at any time. And, let's see how we go along from there. And by the way, this also is a place where there are lots of pictures that can be drawn, and they're very interesting pictures. So I think Professor Sheikh will give you quite a few pictures of various things that go on here. Okay, so let's start. So what we are doing, so let me minimize this also. Minimize. So As usual, there are a lot of some definitions one has to make about what one is talking about, and it's not too difficult to understand what it is. So what are you talking about? So you take a finite connected graph, and this no degree 1 vertices is not really relevant, okay? And it may have multiple edges. That means you could have more than one edge joining two vertices, or it may have loops at the same edge, okay? But in general, we should think about this whenever one is starting to understand the subject, you must think of the simplest cases first, okay? So we'll think of the simplest cases where these things are not there, okay? So let AX be the adjacency matrix of X. The cardinality of the vertices is N, cardinality of the H set is M. And A sub X has entries Aij, which is an N by N matrix, where Aij is, if I is not equal to J, it's the number of edges between Vi and Vj, and it's twice the number of loops at I, okay? So what I want to do is label the edges, okay, and give them arbitrary directions. So you give some directions to the edges, call them E1 to EM, where each EI has a direction. And then I'm going to introduce the edges with the opposite directions. EM plus 1 is E1 inverse, EM plus J is EJ inverse for wherever J goes from 1 to M. So I'm on each of the edges, I'm introducing both the directions. And the edge with one direction, I'm going to call EM plus 1, and the opposite direction will be EM plus J, okay? Where EJ is the edge EJ with the opposite direction. So what is a walk is a usual thing. Walk is or you're going along an oriented edge, and the end point of the previous edge is the terminus. The terminus of the previous edge is the initial point of the next edge, okay? You say that it has a backtrack if you're going from Vi to Vj along the edge AI, and the next step is from AI plus 1 to from Vj to Vi. We are going backwards. So this is called a backtrack. It's obviously the name that you would get. The length is the length of the walk, and we say that the walk has a tail if the last edge is the inverse of the first edge. The walk is closed if the end of the edge end point is the initial point, okay? Now there's some notation we're going to use. T of AS is the terminus, and it's sort of, this is one place where you should understand that giving the correct notation for various things solves a great deal of problems. The terminus of one edge, T is a terminus, is the start of the last edge. Terminus of AS, SS is the start of AS. Very bad notation, okay? SS is the two S's mean different things. The start of AS and the terminus of AS. And you say if the walk is closed, okay, and it is this length, then what do you mean by the square? So if the walk is closed, the end point of the last edge is the initial point of the first edge, and therefore you can take the square, which is you're just going around that path twice. And similarly, you can talk about the nth power of that closed path. So we say a closed path is prime or primitive if it is not the power of something else, okay? Where both are backtrackless, tailless, closed paths, okay? So we say it's prime if it is not the power of some other closed path. The equivalence class of a backtrackless, tailless, closed path is the set of all paths which is starting at any of the vertices on C. So you have A1 to AS, you're starting at the initial point of A1, but you could also start at the end point of A1, which is the initial point of A2, and go in the same direction. Similarly, you can start at every point on that edge, okay? The path C starting at each of its vertices. So the equivalence class, you take all these paths, let them start at any of the vertices on that path and go around in that particular direction. So a prime in the graph is an equivalence class of primitive, closed, tailless, backtrackless paths. So you're taking equivalence classes here, please remember. Okay, so this is a tail, This is a closed path, and this is a square of the closed path because you're going around it twice. Okay, so this is just to, whenever you're thinking of an idea, you should always have the simplest examples in front of you of what each of the terms mean. And notice that a path is not the same as the inverse of the path. Going around the path in one direction is not the same as going around the path in the other directions. So though the paths are the same, the orientation is different. So for example, you have this A1, A2, A3 is different from A1 inverse, A3 inverse, A2 inverse, whatever, A1, A2, A3. You have A3 inverse, A2 inverse, or A1 inverse, A2, 3 inverse, whatever. A3 inverse, A2 inverse, A1 inverse. Okay. So you can go around the path in whichever direction. You must keep track of the direction. So the simplest example is that if you have a cycle of length n, this is what was being talked about over the last 4 lectures. Okay. If you have a cycle of length n, there are 2 primes, which is going around that cycle in one direction and going around the cycle in the other direction. Okay. There are exactly 2 primes. Everything else is a power of this. Okay. And then again, as I say, whenever you're having some idea, you look at a simple example and try to understand what is the meaning of, okay, a prime, a closed, backtrackless, tailless path, etc., etc. So you take some example and try to write down what are primes. And you will understand that even in this simple example like this, there are infinitely many primes. And there is no prime factorization theorem into unique factorization into primes business in this. Okay. So there are infinitely many primes in this thing. The Ihara zeta function. So what is it that I'm talking about? The Ihara zeta function for a finite connected graph. Now there's no real need to have this without degree 1 vertices. It can remain there. Okay. So the Ihara zeta function at U, which depends on the graph X, is you take all primes P. Okay, primes P means you have closed, backtrackless, tailless equivalence classes of paths. Take all the primes, take the length of that prime, take 1 minus u to the length of P, take its inverse, and take the product over all such primes. Sort of simple enough formula to understand. And you will also see that this has something to do with the formula that you had for the zeta functions that you talked about when you're talking about number theory. Okay, that was 1 over 1 minus p to the power n for s for over all primes p and all s. Anyway, so there's some relationship. It looks similar, but then one has to be careful that why do you call it a zeta function. Okay, so this is the definition. And even in the simple case that we have here, okay, this is an infinite product, because there are infinitely many primes even in a simple thing like this. Only when you have a cycle do you have exactly 2 primes. Whereas simple things like this also you have infinitely many primes. So this is an infinite product. I'm taking the product over all primes of 1 minus u to the length of that prime. Okay, equivalence classes of primes. So 1 minus length of p, its inverse, and take the product and call that the zeta function. Okay, product is over all primes p and x. The product has. So the first question is that how do you know that this quantity actually exists? Why does it converge? Okay. Obviously, it should say it's the same thing as why does 1 over 1 minus x, 1 over or 1 minus x inverse is equal to is a convergent business that sum over 1 x to the n over all n, that business. Why is that convergent? Okay. So you're not saying that it is convergent everywhere, but it converges for sufficiently small u. Okay. So there's a theorem which says that this product has a positive radius of convergence, which you call Rx. Rx has something special. There's a notation for that. It's the radius of convergence of the zeta function. Okay. And there's a classic sort of theorem which tells you that Rx is positive. Okay. So it actually really has a positive radius of convergence around 0. Okay. And it is clear. So this is, this is one of those classic theorems which no one really talks about nowadays. It's the example, it's what's called Landau's theorem for power series with positive coefficients. Okay. And then it is easy to see that the zeta function for the cycle is just 1 minus u to the n. There are only 2 primes, each have length n. Okay. And therefore, the zeta function is just 1 minus u to the power n to the power 1 minus 2, to the power minus 2. 1 over 1 minus u to the power n. Okay, this is radius of convergence, that is 1. And it's also easy to see that immediately from this, that the zeta function for a tree, take any tree.
Professor, may
Yeah.
Where the u comes from? It's a complex number.
It's a parameter. Yes, it's a complex number. Yeah. It's u is a complex number.
Yeah.
Okay.
Is there choosing in u is anything related to graph?
The whole thing is related to the graph. Okay.
Yeah.
And I'll just say a little bit more about that. This is a function that I'm associating to a graph. It's a complex valued function of a complex variable.
Oh,
okay. So given a graph, I'm associating this complex valued function of a complex variable to that graph. Okay. So it's a function from C to C. It's not the whole of C. It is in some neighborhood of the origin, because outside that neighborhood, it does not converge it. So the questions are, where are the poles? Is it analytic? What can you say about the residues at the poles? All these kind of questions come up. Okay.
Okay.
And by the way, so the point here is that, you see, we are counting something. I hope you understand that in this, we are counting something. What are we counting? We are counting primes and the lengths of the primes, and then we are taking some product, and then to each graph, we are associating some numbers. So what are we doing? To the graph X, we are associating the numbers, take a prime P, take the length of P. So I have length of P for each prime P associated to the graph. So I have this infinite sequence of numbers, okay? And I'm putting these numbers together to get one function, okay? And therefore you can do this. This is for a graph and primes. You can do it for any setup, yes? You can do it for any object. You associate a sequence of numbers to that object, and you put those numbers together in some function as coefficients of some analytic function or something like that. That's all that's going on. Why do you do it in this particular way, etc., is where all the interesting things. So the idea is very simple. To an object, and it has nothing to do with graph theory. To an object in a certain class, we are associating a sequence of numbers, okay, lengths of P. Object is the graph. To the graph, I'm associating this infinite sequence of numbers, namely lengths of primes. Close, backtrackless, tailless, paths with etc. Okay, so that to the graph, I'm associating this infinite sequence of numbers, length of primes, and I'm putting these numbers together to give me one function. Okay, sort of very general philosophy that is involved here, and I should put those numbers together so that in such a way that when I vary x and look at the function, when you vary x, it should tell you a lot of things about x. Okay. So why are these? So there are a whole family of zeta functions. This is one particular example of a zeta function. And there are many different kinds of zeta functions which sort of encapsulate different properties of whatever it is that you're talking about. Okay, so it's clear that the zeta function for a cycle is 1 minus u squared to the minus 2. It is clear that the zeta function for a tree, you see, in a tree there are no closed, backtrackless, tailless loops, paths. So for zeta function for a tree, that product is a trivial product. There's no product. So the zeta function for a tree is 1. Okay, and the fact that the zeta function of the tree is 1 gives a proof of this Bapat theorem, Bapat-Pati theorem that Shiva Ramakrishnan was talking about 3 days ago. okay, which says that the Q Laplacian of a tree, okay, is also independent of the number of vertices of the tree. So that is follows from this business. Anyway, we'll come to that a little while later. So this is the idea. If you're just taking the product over all primes. This is an infinite product. And how do you calculate all the primes? Okay, it's not at all easy to see. So this is some kind of analytic function. It will have poles. And how do you calculate it? This is the definition. So you see there's a definition, and then the question is, how do you calculate this business? Okay. So what is amazing is that there's a formula which tells you what that product is. So let Qj plus 1 be the degree of the jth vertex. Okay, that means Qj is the degree of the jth vertex minus 1. Take Qe to be the diagonal matrix, which is Q1 up to Qn. Remember the n vertices. Let R equal to E minus V plus 1. And, this is actually a property of the graph, a topological property of the graph, that R is the rank of the fundamental group of X. Okay. Calculate E, number of edges minus number of vertices plus 1. If A is the adjacency matrix of X, then the zeta function inverse is equal to 1 minus u squared to the R minus 1 determinant 1 minus A u plus q u squared. Now, if you remember what Krishnan was talking about, Krishnan did not talk about the zeta function, but he talked about this determinant 1 minus A plus q u, 1 minus AU plus q u squared. That was called, he called it the q determinant. So the notation that Shiva Ramakrishnan was using was that the u, what I am calling u, Krishnan had called q. And what I am calling q, Krishnan had called delta minus 1. Okay. So delta was a diagonal matrix of degrees of the vertices. So what I am calling capital Q, Krishnan had called capital delta minus 1. And what I'm calling little u, Krishnan had called q. And this determinant 1 minus AU plus QU squared was called the q determinant. So it should correspond to the u determinant of that matrix. Okay. And here is what I mean to say that, you see, if X is a tree, then zeta X is u, zeta X of u is 1. And therefore, this determinant 1 minus AU plus QU squared is 1 minus u squared to the R minus 1. In the case of a tree, R is equal to minus 1. Okay, because the number of edges minus number of vertices is 1. Okay, so R is equal to 0. Sorry, R is equal to edges minus vertices is minus 1. So R is equal to 0. And therefore, determinant is equal to 1 minus u squared. Okay, so this was the theorem that Krishnan had talked about in his lecture, that this q determinant is equal to 1 minus u squared. It's independent of the number of vertices in that tree. Okay, what is remarkable about this? The remarkable thing about this is that you have zeta x u is an infinite product. Okay, its inverse is a polynomial in u. Okay, this thing I have on the right hand side is a polynomial. Okay, actually I should be slightly more careful. It's not, I mean, really a polynomial. It's a rational function. R could be negative. Okay, R could be 0. So anyway, it's a polynomial. So I shouldn't write polynomial here. I should write it's a ratio of polynomials. And the denominator is at the most going to be something like 1 minus u squared to some power. So I hope you understand that this is quite remarkable. The definition of zeta x of u is an infinite product of going over all primes in that graph. Okay, and you don't even know what all the primes are, even though it's a countable set. You know it's a countable set. But if you take zeta x u inverse, it is a ratio of polynomials. This polynomial is wrong. It should be ratio of polynomials. Okay. And therefore, if you have this formula is just calculating a determinant. All the adjacency matrix, you know, Q, you know, okay. And therefore, you can calculate this formula for any graph. And just to convince yourself, just check that the zeta of K4 inverse is that particular polynomial. And if you remove an edge, zeta of that is equal to this particular polynomial. Okay, all you are expected to do is expand that determinant out. You'll get these formula. Okay. And just for some later reason, I'm going to write down that if I know that zeta x u inverse is whatever that formula I have here, I can calculate u d by du of log of zeta of K4. Why do you want to calculate u d du of log of zeta K4? We'll come to that a bit later. Okay. And you'll get some formula on the right-hand side. It'll be an infinite sum, but you can truncate it at every point, at whichever place you want to truncate it. Okay, so you get some infinite series. And again, you should understand that it is remarkable that all the coefficients are integers. Okay, 24, 24, 96, whatever those 12, 8, 24, etc. And there's a further thing involved. Okay, 24, look at this coefficient 24 and 3. You cube the 3 there, 24 and 4. And 96, and so look at 24 and 3 into 2. Look at 24 and 4 into 2. Look at 96 and 6 into 2. And you will understand that 24 is divisible by 3 into 2. 24 is divisible by 4 into 2. 96 is divisible by 8 into 2, I hope. Yes. Okay.
Why
Similarly
to
here.
take 2 there?
What?
Why you are taking only 2?
So let me answer your question a bit later on. It has to do with that if you have a prime, you can go around the prime in 2 directions. Okay, the 2 is that 2 which you can go a prime in the clockwise direction and in the anti-clockwise direction. Okay, so these numbers 24 divided by 6, 24 divided by 4, 96 divided by 12, 12 divided by 6, 8 divided by 8, 24 divided by 12. These are numbers about that graph. Okay, and the question is, what do these numbers count? Okay, so I'll come to that a little while on. The point is that all these numbers are very special numbers, and these numbers tell you properties about that graph. Okay, so I'll tell you what those numbers are in a little while. So the coefficients count something about the graph. So you see, the zeta function counts something. And the moment you have a formula for the zeta function, where is that gone? This is called the Basi-Hara determinantal formula. Where are we now? This determinant. Okay, the moment we have that determinant thing, the right-hand side is easy to calculate. It's a determinant. Therefore, the left-hand side tells you, the right-hand side is going to tell you a great deal about the properties of the graph X. Okay, so the main reason for having this, main reason for series of this 1 hour lecture is to try and prove this formula. Okay, and it's an amazing proof. As today morning you were talking about, it's an amazing proof. It's a beautiful proof. And I have no idea why it works. Okay, so I have no idea why this system, why this proof works. But it is such an elementary proof that it can be done as soon as someone knows about determinants and matrices. Okay, second year SY BSc, this proof can be given. Okay, it is that elementary. Why it works, or how did Bas think of it, is something which is, I have no idea. Okay. So apparently this formula came. Yeah.
So Bas visited our department. So
Yes.
did you ask him at
Yes.
that time?
Yes.
What did he
And
say?
he gave a very, usual, what should one say? Muddled, not, I shouldn't say muddled, but very sort of smiled answer that, oh, this person, Ihara has done, the way Ihara came up with some formula has something to do with representation theory of spin groups, finite spinners or something like that. Okay. So it was representation theory of a particular class of finite groups is how Ihara came up with this formula. Okay. Then Bas said that, so Bas talked about something else. I was hoping that he would talk about this, but he did not. And then at the end of it, I asked him that, I mean, how did you think about this proof? So his answer was very, what should one say? Political or polite or whatever you'd like to say. He said, oh, no, I was reading Ihara's proof, which had to do a great deal with representations of those particular finite groups, complicated finite groups. And then I thought that no, it should be something, a very vague answer of why he came up with this thing was, so he thought that Ihara's proof should have something which is simpler that is going on. And then he started working on it and then he came up with this. So it was an answer which was not really an answer. Okay, so that is, so as Solapur, is another lesson for Solapur. You should learn how to give answers which are not really answers. Okay. But it's amazing. I mean, it's amazing how this page
And
goes.
are there other proofs also?
I mean, the original proof has something to do with representation theory of those finite groups. Okay.
So that is by
And
Ihara.
Ihara, yes.
Okay.
Huh? I don't know of any other proofs. I mean, this is the one which is so elementary that, I don't know what else one would do. Okay. Okay, so I have written out the whole proof. And there are pieces of that are actually very interesting in themselves. Okay, some ideas that are involved there. But as usual, I'm going to run out of time and I don't think that, anyway, let's see how it goes. Okay, so these numbers, what I want to point out is that you can calculate zeta of the graph very easily by expanding that determinant. You will get some coefficients, okay? And you take this thing, you get these numbers, and these numbers tell you a great deal about that graph, okay? Coefficients count something about graphs. The question is what. So by the way, this is again a statement that I believe it is due to Erdos. I'm not sure who it is. I tried to find it out and I couldn't. And the statement is that the moment you can count anything about an object, you have a great deal of power. Okay. Counting gives you power. So counting that 24 gives you a great deal of power. I hope you understand what I mean. Okay, because it tells you a great deal of things about the graph K4. Okay. So the Ihara-Bas zeta function basically allows you to count. Okay. But what does it count? Okay, so let's try to see how long it will take to do this. Oh, by the way, I had actually given this proof once it was about 2-3 hours to a MSc class in Kolhapur. And I think they understood it. And of course, it took 2-3 hours because I was writing everything. One of the advantages or disadvantages of having online lectures is that one can flash many more screens and do many more things and hope that your audience has learned much more. And of course, it never works that way. You have to, the only way that you can understand something is by someone, as Gokul said, doing it with chalk on a blackboard. That is the only way a student can understand. Doing it online on a screen, all very well and good, but it doesn't really help you understand until you do it on a chalk and blackboard. Anyway, there are advantages that I can do all this in an hour, and you can go back and read it whenever you want to read it, if you want to read it. So you take a graph, you take the directed edges of the graph. So there are m edges, and I put directions on them, and I take the reverse direction. So I get 2m directed edges, which are the original edges with both the directions. Cardinality of I is 2m. I is equal to E1 to EM with one set of directions, and you have EM plus 1 to EM plus M with another set of directions. So I should make this comment here also. So remember, when I'm talking about the Ihara zeta function, I had said you calculate the number, you calculate all these paths. First, what was the first step? The first step was give directions to the paths, give directions to each edge. Okay. And then I was counting various things about, closed paths and whatever. So obviously, what I'm counting will depend on the directions that I'm giving. Okay, the directions and orientations that I've given to each edge. So whatever I'm counting, prime, close, prime, backtrack, less, etc., paths depend on the choice of directions of the edges. Okay, so everything is zeta x of u. When I write that down, it will depend on the choice of the directions of the edges. Therefore, I can't call it just zeta x of u. I should call it zeta x and the directions. And what this theorem proves is that the left-hand side depends on the directions that you're giving to the edges. But see, on the right-hand side, there are no directions. Okay. So the thing that I have on the right-hand side does not depend on the directions that you choose. So what it says is that the Ihara zeta function does not depend on the directions that you choose. Okay. Even though initially it looks as if it depends on the directions, but the right-hand side tells you that it does not depend on the direction, which also is quite amazing if you think about it. Okay. So the directions are irrelevant in all these things. Directions you give to each edge. So I put some choice of some edges, take some directions, put some whatever edges. So now I'll introduce what is called the edge adjacency matrix, W1, is a 2m by 2m matrix whose ith, jth entry, m is a number of edges. So there are 2m directed edges. Take each, what is the ijth entry? It is 1 if the edge ei feeds into the edge ej, provided ej is not equal to ei inverse, and it's 0 otherwise. What is the meaning of an edge feeds into another edge? It means that the terminus of the first edge is the start of the second edge. E1 feeds into E2 if the terminus of E1, the endpoint of E1, is the starting point of E2. Okay, that is the meaning of terminus and starting point, feeds into EJ. Terminus for EI is the start of EJ, which is the initial point. W1 is also denoted by, or is called the transition matrix T. So T is a I cross I matrix. I is 2m. Tij is EI. T of EI EJ depends on the edges. Ijth entry is 1 if EI feeds into EJ and EI is not equal to EJ inverse, and it's 0 otherwise. Mod I is 2m is finite. And so I to the Z, so you see, you'll see now beginning to see that quite a few things come. By the way, here I should also tell you that this is a particular case of what is called the Ruelle zeta function, R-E-U-L-L-E or R-U-E-L-L-E. And Ruelle zeta functions, there's a whole family of zeta functions. And the Ruelle zeta function is one of them. I mean, it sort of covers a large part of that family. And in each of these zeta functions, you have this kind of a transition matrix. But so the zeta function theory is actually applicable to very large numbers of very large areas of mathematics. Mod I is 2m. This is a finite set. So I to the Z, okay, sequences from Z to I. Okay. So this is I to the Z. It's a countable product of i's, which is a finite set. Therefore, it is compact. Therefore, I to the Z is a compact set. So this is a compact set, I to the Z, sequences from Z to I. Lambda is all paths in X without backtracking corresponding to which, so take all paths
What is
in X.
what is I here? Excuse me.
I is that set E1 to EM plus 1 up to E2M.
Okay.
So you can just think of it as 1 to 2M.
Okay.
Okay, 1 corresponds to E1, 2 corresponds to E2, etc. 2M corresponds to EM plus M, which is EM inverse. Okay.
So these zeta k's are numbers from 1 to n. 1 to
Yeah.
2n.
So I mean, you think of them as numbers or you think of them as edges.
Okay. Fine.
There are 2M edges. So the I is those 2M edges.
So that every graph can be oriented in opposite direction also.
Yeah, each of the edges have both the directions
Both the direction.
at the same time. That's why I have E1 to EM, the
Okay.
edges with one direction, and EM plus 1 is E1 with the opposite direction.
Okay.
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 So you
Maybe-
can think of psi k's as being elements from numbers 1 to 2M, or you can think of it as the edge EM, EI is that one particular edge. Okay. So lambda is all paths in X without backtracking, and they correspond to I to the Z. So lambda is psi k. And when do we have no backtracking? If this T, the transition matrix, is always successively T of psi k plus 1. Okay, T, remember, is indexed by those edges. So this psi is in lambda if T psi k plus 1 is equal to 1 for all k. So these are paths, okay, with no where the end point of the first of psi I feeds into the terminus point of psi I feeds into the start of psi I plus 1.
So what is T here? T of?
T is this previous matrix. W is also denoted by the transition matrix T. T is a better notation than W. W is used for a different thing. So Tij, T is indexed by those edges. Tij is Teij. It is 1 if Ei feeds into Ej and Ei is not equal to Ej inverse. Okay. Teij, that particular matrix, okay, it's a 2m by 2m matrix indexed by the edges. And if you want the ijth entry, you look at Teij, okay, and Teij is 1 if Ei feeds into Ej and Ei is not equal to Ej inverse, and it's 0 otherwise. Okay, the transition matrix. By the way, these transition matrices arise a great deal in physics also. That's why physics people are interested in it. So lambda is all those psi's such that successive T, psi k plus 1 is equal to 1. That means psi k feeds into psi k plus 1. Okay. So each psi k is an I. This lambda is a closed subset of the compact set, and therefore lambda is compact. Okay. So a continuous function such that psi tau, so the tau of psi k is psi k plus 1. You're shifting the psi. So a continuous function tau from lambda to lambda, so the tau of psi k plus 1 is called a subshift of finite type. Okay, because you're shifting by 1 unit. You could just as well have shifted by 10 units. Okay, but shifting by 10 units is tau to the power n. So tau is called a subshift of finite type. And obviously the fixed points of tau to the power s. Okay, you take tau to the power s, take its fixed points. That means tau to the power s of psi is equal to psi. Okay, and what does that mean? It means that, see, what is the meaning of tau to the power s of psi is equal to psi? That means that psi is a closed path of length s. So the fixed point of tau to the power s is the number of closed paths in tau in X without backtracking or tails. Okay, so the cardinality of the fixed points of tau to the power s counts the number of closed paths without backtracking or tails, which I'll call ns of X, which I'll also denote by ns. There's going to be some notational problem here.
Closed paths of length s, right?
Yeah. We have a number of closed paths in X without backtracking or tails of length s. I have not written that down. Please make a note of this. Okay. Here I want without backtracking or tails of length s. Okay. NS is the number of closed paths of length S. Now W1 is equal to T, is a transition matrix. And therefore, what is a trace of W1 to the power S? Okay. Now the trace of any matrix to the power is the sum of, trace of A squared is AIK, AKJ, sum AIK, AKI, sum over all I and K. Yeah. Trace of A squared, if you have a finite matrix A, and nothing to do with adjacency matrix. If you have a finite matrix B, what is the trace of B squared? What is the trace of B? It is summation BII. What is the trace of B squared? It is summation BIK, BKI, sum over I and K. So what is the trace of T to the power S? It is T alpha 1, alpha 2, alpha 2, alpha 3, alpha S, alpha 1 over all oriented edges, which are from E1 to EM, and alpha 1 to alpha S are points there. It is very, very trivial. Huh? What is the trace of the square of a matrix? Note that each of these are 0 unless edge alpha R feeds into alpha R plus 1 and alpha R plus 1 is not equal to alpha R inverse. So such a summand is 0 means that this is a closed backtrackless tailless path of length S. So we have NS is trace of W1 to the power S. Okay, the number of closed paths of length S, backtrackless, tailless, blah, blah, blah. And this is the first sort of amazing calculation that comes up, which tells you that you're on the right track, which is zeta x inverse. The zeta function is actually determinant of 1 minus W1 of U. Okay. Zeta inverse is that infinite product. W1 of U is this matrix I can calculate easily. Okay. It's a 2m by 2m matrix. So I can calculate the right-hand side easily. The left-hand side, of course, is difficult to calculate. But these two things are the same. Why? So again, this is an amazing calculation which comes up everywhere. Okay. In this area, this calculation comes up everywhere. The zeta function is a product. Obviously, you don't like products, you like sums. Therefore, you take log on both sides. So log of zeta is log of this product. Log of a product is sum of the logs. Log of 1 minus x is summation x to the n by n with a minus sign. So log x, 1 minus x is x to the n by n, that minus sign. Therefore, you can substitute that here, which becomes L of p, and it has LP elements in the equivalence class. Therefore, you get the next line. And therefore, it's the sum of closed backtrackless, tailless plots of this. And therefore, this is equal to n to the s, u to the s over s, which is ns over s, u to the s. It's a amazingly, what should one say, straightforward calculation. What is very smart is coming up with that matrix W. Okay. And therefore, log zeta x is equal to n to the s, u to the s over s, s greater than or equal to 1. N to the s is a trace. You can take trace out of the sum, and therefore summation W1 to the s, u to the s over s is just log of 1 minus u W1. So again, here there is some little bit to understand that sum of x to the n over n is log of 1 minus x. And this formula is also true for matrices. Which formula? So I've written that formula down here, where here, this formula. Log of 1 minus x is summation over n, x to the n over n. Okay, this is done in, I believe it's done in 12th standard also. Okay, so this formula for the log is done in 12th standard. And what is done in probably MSc classes, I hope it's done. It used to be done when I was teaching it, but anyway, I hope it's done. That this formula, log of 1 minus x is minus summation x to the n by n. This formula is also true for matrices. Okay. Slightly careful, you have to be there. So I'm using that formula here for matrices. Summation of W of x to the n over n is log of 1 minus x. Okay. power series for log for matrices, and therefore you got log of this determinant. Yeah, so there's another thing that one must understand is that trace of the log of a matrix is log of the determinant of the matrix. So again, this is something that we have to do. And the exercise is exponential of the trace of a matrix is determinant of exponential of that matrix. Okay, take log on both sides for matrices. Therefore, that thing is the same, and therefore you get that formula. Okay, and therefore here itself you'll see that zeta x is the inverse of a polynomial because this right-hand side is a polynomial. Okay, so there are many zeta functions. The above calculation shows that zeta x is a particular case of what is called the Ruel zeta function. And therefore, go back to those numbers that I had told you there. So what it tells you is that there are 8 primes of length 3 in K4. There are 6 primes of length 4 in K4. And these primes come both in one direction and the opposite direction. So the primes without direction will be 8 divided by 2. Primes of length 4 will be 6 divided by 2. So those coefficients that I'm getting there, okay, are lengths of primes. Okay. So you will understand that those numbers that I'm getting there when I was talking about K4 and K4 minus an H tell you a great deal about that particular graph. So the zeta function encodes a large part of the structure of the graph. Okay, because, and I hope you understand that this is remarkable, that those coefficients of that thing are integers, and the nth integer is divisible by n. It's actually divisible by 2n. Where did I have it? Here. The third integer, the third coefficient is divisible by 3. In fact, it's divisible by 2 into 3. The next coefficient is divisible by 4 into 2. The next coefficient is divisible by 90. So these numbers are very special. Okay. 12 is divisible by 3. In fact, 12 is divisible by 3 into 4. 8 is divisible by 4 into 2. 24 is divisible by 6 into 2. So all these are even numbers, first of all, and they're all, the coefficient of u to the n in this thing is divisible by 2n. U to the k is divisible by 2k. So they're very special numbers. Okay. Zeta function encodes a large part of the structure, and these include the fact that zeta function determines many things about the graph. For example, it determines the peak number of the graph, it determines number of Hamiltonian cycles, it determines number of spanning trees, complexity of a graph, and there are a whole bunch of properties that it determines. So it's very, these set of papers are not very old, okay? They're all within the last 15 years or so, where these kind of things have been talked about. And then the zeta function satisfies a functional, the Riemann zeta function satisfies a functional equation. And if you have a regular graph, then a regular graph also satisfies a functional equation. What is the meaning of a functional equation? This lambda of u, which is zeta x multiplied by something. So lambda x of u is related to lambda x of 1 over qu. Q is the degree of regularity, plus 1. So there are functional equations, and there are more functional equations for a regular graph. Okay, now let me come to this proof of this. The actual proof of the Ihara-Bas theorem. Bas's proof of Ihara's determinantal formula. That is what it says. So this is the formula we want to prove. R minus 1 is E minus V. W is a 2m by 2m matrix indexed by the oriented edges. E1 to EM, EM plus 1, EM plus M. W1, E1, EJ is 1 if EI feeds into EJ. So what is the claim? The claim is W1 has this block decomposition. Call this block decomposition A, B, C, D. W is 2m by 2m. A is m by m. All these are m by m. And then the theorem is that A and D, A is the transpose of D, B is self-adjoint, Remember, W has only 0, 1 entries. Okay. So A is D transpose, B is self-adjoint, C is self-adjoint, and it has diagonal path 0. Okay. Now, this is Bas's proof. I'm beginning, this is Bas's proof of the theorem. So if you look at some PQth element in D, dpq is equal to 1 if and only if em plus p feeds into em plus q, which is, what is em plus p? It is ep inverse. If and only if ep inverse feeds into eq, but ep inverse feeds into eq means eq feeds into ep, and therefore a qp is 1. Completely elementary given the proof. Bim plus j is 1 if and only if ei feeds into em plus j, if and only if ei feeds into ej inverse, bjm plus 1, ej, etc. So this is what feeds into what. Okay. Very elementary. Summation j equal to 1, w1 ij is the sum of the rows in the ith row. It is the degree of the starting vertex. And W1. So these are very elementary observations. Okay. Then I will talk about the start matrix. So the start matrix is a n by 2m start matrix. So it's rows are indexed by vertices and the columns are indexed by the directed edges. Okay. SVE is 1 if V is the start of the edge E. Otherwise it's 0. T is so S is the start matrix, T is the terminal matrix, TVE is equal to 1 if V is the terminus of the edge E. You write S in the block form M and N, okay? Then T is in the block form, S is in the block form MN, N rows and 2M columns. When you interchange the N and the M, you will see that you get T. It's clear what is start and what is the terminus, what is the inverse of the edge, etc., etc. This is just definition. J is this off-diagonal identities you put. So 2m by 2m, along the diagonals you put the 0 block, and in the off-diagonal paths you put identity, m by m identities. Okay. S times j is t and t times j is s. Is just this business that s is mn and t is nm. Then the statement is a is equal to st. So a is equal to s into the transpose of t. I've written it slightly carefully. Okay, it's sort of the way that the transpose is written is t transpose, s times t transpose. Q is s times S transpose, and S times S transpose is also T times T transpose, and W1 plus J is T transpose times S. Why? Look at S times T transpose, okay, is going to be a sum over edges, SVE, T transpose EV, EW, but T transpose EW is TWE. This summand is either 0 or 1, and the summand is 1 if E is an edge which starts at V and ends at W. Okay, but that is A VW if V is not equal to W, and AVV, which is twice the number of loops. Okay, and similarly SS transpose is 0, it's equal to the degree of V, and similarly with TT transpose. I am going very fast over all this because it is extremely elementary. You just have to understand what is the meaning of the start matrix and the terminus matrix. Okay. You can see that it is very elementary. There's nothing much that is going on here. You're just counting things correctly. Okay. T transpose T, T transpose EV, SVF is equal to 1 if E feeds into F, even if F is E inverse, etc., etc., and therefore we have W. Now, zeta x of u is this determinant. And then this is what is amazing. This is an amazing formula. The following block identity holds for n plus 2m by n plus 2m matrices. there are n plus 2m rows, n plus 2m columns. And I'm going to tell you a block identity. Okay, so this formula that we have proved earlier says that this matrix into that matrix is equal to this matrix into that matrix. This is Bas's proof, and the proof is over. Okay, take determinants of both sides. This is block triangular, so it's just one. Block of this is 1 minus u squared times determinant 1i2m minus w1u. This is the zeta function which we have proved. Okay, and on the right hand side you have 1 minus au, determinant of this into this times 1. And what is determinant im plus ju? Im plus ju is this, and therefore you can write down what the determinant is. Im plus ju into this is im 1 minus u squared. This finishes the proof. Okay, this is an amazing, Bas came up with this particular identity, block identity of matrices. Why did he come up with this? And once you have this block identity, the block identity itself comes very easily. Sorry about that. It comes very easily, but how did he come up with this identity? Okay, is the question. So, by the way, someone's trying to call me. I hope you can see my screen and can hear me. Yes, no?
Yes, sir.
Okay. It's someone else who was calling. Yeah. We always have these horror stories of someone continuing to lecture online for 20 minutes and the audience trying desperately to contact him and telling him that, him or her, that, sir, you're not visible and you're not audible. So whenever you get a lecture phone call like this, you always wonder that, are you visible and are you audible? Anyway, the point is that this formula is extremely elementary. You can give it to a SY BSc student and the SY BSc student will understand it. The only thing he will not understand is log 1 minus x is equal to summation x to the n over n with a minus sign. That he will understand. She will understand. But what she will not understand is that that same formula works for matrices. Okay? Nothing else in this at all. It's an amazing calculation. And as was said in the morning, it's a beautiful calculation. Okay. So this finishes the proof, and the question is, how did Bas think about this? So it's a very elementary proof. Okay, so there is much more to this theory of graphs now. 3:20. So I have till 3:45. No, so I still have 20 minutes remaining. So I want to tell you a little bit about covering. So there's a great deal of mathematics. By the way, any questions here? I should stop and pause a little bit to, what should I do?
This zeta function.
Yeah.
So you have a graph and it will have automorphism group. So will automorphism group influence this zeta function in any way?
Yeah. So yes, it does. I'm going to talk about that when I talk about coverings. I want particular kinds of coverings of that graph. Okay, automorphisms of that graph. Okay.
No, graph. I'm talking about not the Galois automorphism. I'm talking about the automorphism group of the graph automorphisms. So
the graph automorphism group, okay, will not change those determinants. Okay, what is connected is connected. Okay. I mean that A and Q and this and that will not change. The formula that you have for the zeta function, if suppose you act on the automorphism group, on that graph, okay, and the right hand side just is the graph. On the right hand side, nothing will change because A will be the same, the Q will be the same, the whatever. So the zeta functions will not do anything. Nothing will change in the zeta function. But what happens is for the coverings, when something gets changed in the covering, then what are the covering transformations? What are they called? Deck transformations. So the question is, what happens for the deck transformations of the covering spaces of that graph? Okay, because then you're changing the graph. And that is where all this business that I hope Asif will talk about it tomorrow. And that's where a great deal of number theory and whatever else comes in there of, so what is the Galois theory for graphs? So you may not have heard about this earlier, but there's a Galois theorem that one can prove for graphs. And again, this Galois theorem for graphs is far more elementary than the Galois theorem for fields that you teach. Okay. And in fact, the right thing to do now is first teach Galois theorem for graphs and then teach Galois theorem for fields and covering spaces and whatever. So anyway, let me just continue a little bit. Okay, what do I want to do now? I want to minimize this. What is this? Okay, so coverings. So a graph is called so there's another word, this word ramified and unramified you might have heard earlier.
Sir, I have one question.
Yeah.
Sir, here for every edge, you have assigned 2 directions.
Yeah.
So such graphs are also called as a gain graphs. Gain graphs, which is discussed in refresher course by Professor T. Asif.
I see. Mm-hmm.
Is there any relation?
No, I'm sorry, I didn't attend that lecture, so I really don't know. But yes, I mean, it is that the graph has 2 directions.
Yes.
But what we are using the directions for is to count these particular kind of primes, which are closed, mactrackless, tailless paths. Okay. So I don't know whether he was also in that particular lecture, he was talking about these kind of paths. Okay. If he was talking about those kind of paths, then definitely there's a relation, but I'm sorry, I did not attend that. So if I see that, I will also be curious to know why did he put directions there? Okay. Here it's the reason we're putting directions is because we want a path in a direction. Okay. And we don't want to go backtrackless. So is that the reason that he had put directions in that graph? It may be. I mean, but I'm sorry, I didn't attend that, so I don't really know.
Okay, sir.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I'm going to talk about covering. A graph is this word unramified is something that you may have heard before. Of a graph X, if there exists a map, which is a graph map, and it's onto. Graph map means what? Adjacent matrices go to adjacent vertices go to adjacent vertices. And such that if you take any point downstairs and you take any point above that, the collection of points adjacent to Y is bijectively mapped on to collection of points adjacent to X. Now, Asif will be talking about much more about this tomorrow. And in fact, what Professor Prajakta Nimborkar had talked about was also some version of this. Okay, they're talking about products. And there's some isomorphism, local isomorphism business. The 2 graphs locally look the same at each vertex. Okay. However, globally, they may not be the same. Okay. If you restrict yourself to a neighborhood of a vertex, the neighborhood upstairs and downstairs are the same. But globally, it need not be the same in the same sense that, you know, the circle and you take the real line. The real line is a covering space of the circle. Locally, each point on the circle has a neighborhood which looks exactly like neighborhoods of the points which live above it. Okay, so this is a covering space. And then the example you should think of is this K4. And this graph here, which you have also seen, we have seen this graph when you were talking about, you know, Z2 to the power 4. Z2 to the power 3 or 4 or whatever it is, you know, the hypercube. This is a cube. So if you take this K4, a covering space of K4 is the cube. Okay. And how do you obtain this? So the way that it's obtained is you take a spanning tree of the graph, and this is what is going to happen in general. Given this graph, how do you obtain a covering space? Okay. You take a spanning tree of X. So in this particular case, I could take this spanning tree. okay, the spanning tree, and I want to have a two-sheeted covering of that K4. So I will take two copies of the covering tree. Okay, sorry, I'll take 2 copies of the spanning tree. Okay, so I'm labeling them as A1, B1, C1, D1, A2, B2, C2, D2 are the 2 copies of the covering or 2 copies of the spanning tree of X. Okay, so I'm taking the graph, I'm taking any spanning tree, and I'm taking 2 copies of the spanning tree, and I'm trying to join the corresponding vertices. So for example, in this original thing, you have D is connected to C. Okay, so either I can connect D2 to C2, or I can connect D2 to C1. Okay, the one C1, A1, B1, C1, D1 is one tree. It's one sheet of the cover. A2, B2, C2, D2 is another sheet of the cover. And I'm trying to tell you how to go between the sheets. Okay, this is it's actually a very beautiful construction. And as I'm saying, I think Asif will talk about this more yesterday. It's sort of, sorry, Asif will talk about it tomorrow, I hope. I mean, the version of this. Anyway, so the general construction of covers of graphs without loops or multiple edges, what happens when loops or multiple edges are present? And then one has to be slightly more careful. Let Y be an unramified covering of X, and you take a path. Then the point is that, you know, you have this theorem also in topology, covering spaces, algebraic topology, fundamental groups, that if you have a covering space of the space, then any path downstairs lifts uniquely to a path upstairs in the cover, provided you specify the initial point. So this is exactly the same statement, that if you have a path downstairs, that path lifts uniquely to a path upstairs. Okay, so unique lifting property of paths. Don't worry too much about whatever. A D-sheeted covering of X is obtained by taking D copies of a spanning tree. Call the spanning tree Z of X. Take D copies of Z, call them Z1, Z2, ZT, and join corresponding points in a proper way. That is what a D-sheeted covering will be. Okay, I still have 15 minutes. Good. So let Y over X be a D-sheeted covering space with a covering map Y to X. The Galois group of Y over X. So I'm defining what the Galois group is. The Galois group is all those automorphisms of Y, okay, which commute with pi. Pi is a projection map. Deck transformations. The other name for this is deck transformations. So the Galois group of Y over X is all those sigmas which commute with pi. That means pi composed with sigma is pi. And we say that Y over X is normal or a Galois covering if the cardinality of the Galois group is D. Okay. So those examples I given of covering spaces are actually Galois coverings. Okay, which page is this? 14. Okay. Galois group is D, and those examples we have is this. So I should state here that there is the exact analog of the Galois theorem for fields, field extensions. Okay, there is an exact analog of that Galois theory for fields to the Galois theory for graphs. Okay, and in fact, proving the Galois theory for graphs is more elementary than proving the Galois theory for fields. So it is something that should first, Galois theory for graphs should come before Galois theory for fields, because it is more elementary. Now, zeta x inverse is a polynomial in U. If Y over X is a D-sheeted covering of X, zeta of Y inverse is also a polynomial in U. So the question you want to ask is that how are these two polynomials related? Theorem. Suppose Y over X is a D-sheeted covering, then zeta x inverse of U. the zeta x inverse of u is a polynomial of some degree corresponding to the number of vertices in X, okay, n plus r, whatever that u. Zeta y inverse is another polynomial. These are two polynomials. The degree of that zeta y inverse is obviously greater than the degree of zeta x inverse. By the way, in the abstract that was given to you, there's a mistake here, okay? So what was written in the abstract is nearly correct, but not quite correct. And what I'm writing here is correct, okay? There's another thing that I should add to what Solapurkar was saying today, that yes, you must be correct in what you're saying and whatever, but I tell this story many times again that I had an advisor who was, of course, a very good mathematician, excellent. He used to give excellent lectures. And in every lecture, at a very crucial point somewhere or the other, he used to make a mistake. And he had a very convincing way of nodding his head and saying, isn't that true? And of course, all us students which will say, yes, yes, if the sir is saying it's true, then of course it's true. So yes, he used to nod his head very convincingly. Then you go home and try to look over this proof, and then you realize there's something wrong here. This is wrong. How is he telling us something wrong? Then very often you say that, yes, this is wrong, but this other thing is right. This other thing that should have been done there is correct. So the next day one goes and tells him that, sir, you made a mistake at that time. And he very sweetly smiled and said, oh, is that so? You see? So the fellow knew that he was making a mistake, and he wanted to see whether the students knew that there was a mistake there and would tell him the next day that there's a mistake in that whatever he was doing. So students get very happy, and the teacher also knows, yes, the student has done something or the other. Okay, learned a little bit in the process. So whatever you do, it is good not to have everything correct, because then someone will come and tell you that it is wrong. This has happened also in examinations. Huh? Some student raised a question about an exam. How is this correct? This is wrong. And then you go and check, and you realize that what the student is saying is correct, and what the question was wrong. And therefore, your opinion of that student goes up a great deal, because that person realized that there was something wrong. Anyway, that is just by the way. Okay, so I want to show that zeta x, if y is a cover, d-sheeted cover, zeta x inverse divides zeta y inverse. Okay, it's a factor. And remember, this is a non-trivial statement because these are polynomials. How will you know that one polynomial divides another polynomial? Okay, there is, if they're just, if they're polynomials, division is something which is not to be expected. So what is the proof? So zeta x inverse is this formula. If x has n vertices, determinant is the n determinant. Rx is equal to Ex minus Vx. The number of edges is d times in y. The number of edges in y is d times the number of edges in x. The number of vertices in y is d times the number of vertices in x. Therefore, r minus 1 is d times Rx minus 1. And therefore, this first factor divides that other factor. Okay. So in this determinant business, the first factors of x divides that first factor in y. Now, this also is an important construction, okay? Order the vertices of y into d blocks corresponding to the d sheets z1 to zd. It's a d sheeted cover of x, where each z, I have bad notation. I've said each ZQ is a spanning graph of X. I should not have called it ZQ. I should have called it ZR or something. No, not even R. I should have called it Z whatever, D. I'm not D. It's bad notation to use Q there. But anyway, I mean Z1 to ZR. So each Z1 to ZR is a spanning graph of X. So this notation is a bit bad. Let AY consist of the blocks Aij tilde. So AY is the ND by ND matrix. Break that matrix up according to its blocks. Okay, each block is D by D, corresponding to each sheet. So I'm naming the blocks and the sheets okay, according to which sheet it is on. I'm breaking up the big matrix A into smaller blocks, Aij tilde, with one less than ij less than d, and each Aij tilde is a n by n Vx cross Vx matrix, okay? And let I sub y be the block diagonal of I sub x d times. Now the degrees of the vertices in y are the same as the degrees of the vertices in x. When you do the cover, the degrees don't change. So qy is the same as the degrees that you have downstairs. They don't change. So qy is a block diagonal qx, 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 which each qx is a n by n matrix. Okay. And now this is a place where you will understand that you will see that in order to actually prove this business, okay, you have to sit down. Finally, you have to come down and get your hands dirty by writing down what these matrices are. So when I had your K4, okay, and I take a two-sheeted cover, I've given you these examples on page 13. That's why I've drawn it explicitly there. I'm writing down A of y. So you write down what A of y is. It is this matrix, okay, which is this block diagonal form. And A11 tilde plus A12 tilde is equal to A sub x, which is A21 plus A22. And it is easy to see that. So when I take the sum of the row blocks, the row sum of the blocks, I get AX in this particular example. And then you do 5 more examples and you will see that whenever you take the block row sum, you get the adjacency matrix of the downstairs graph. It is always true that summation I equal to 1 to d of Aij tilde is equal to A. Okay, this is very easy to see. Once you know that it is true, it is very easy to see. So now I look at the zeta function for the upstairs graph y. And I look at this particular determinant. There are nd vertices, so I have determinant nd, iy minus ay plus qu squared. Okay, I have 5 more minutes, so it's not too bad. And you write everything in terms of the block form. Okay. And what you do is add all the remaining blocks to the first block. When you add the blocks, when you add columns to the first column, when you add the second column to the first column, determinant does not change. When you add the first column block, when you add the second column block to the first column block, determinant does not change. When you add the third column block to the first column block, determinant does not change. When you add each of these column blocks to the first column block, determinant does not change. And therefore, D is determinant when you add all those things together to the first column block. In the first column, you will have exactly Ix minus Ax plus Qu squared. Therefore, determinant of this thing, this column, now what do? You subtract the first column from each of the, now what do? You subtract the first row from the second row. Let me say that again. You subtract the first block row from the second block row. So the entry in the block 2, 1 will become 0. Do it again with the next, all the following blocks. So when you do that, the determinant does not change, and the first block column consists of Ix minus Ax plus Qu squared in that 1, 1 block and 0 everywhere else. And therefore, the determinant has this factor, which is determinant Ix minus Au plus Qu squared. So when you do this business of adding blocks and adding columns and then adding blocks, finally you get this, and therefore you get this determinant, and therefore determinant is D is equal to this determinant into some number, some other term, okay? And for some alpha, this is a polynomial, and therefore you prove the result, okay? So This is also an amazing proof. Now the question is that in this formula, what is that other alpha? And I believe Professor Sheikh has some idea of what that second alpha will be. We know what the second alpha should be, but we don't know how to prove it. Are you there, Asif? Is Asif there or not? Maybe he isn't.
Yes, sir.
So this alpha, we know what it should be, but we don't know how to prove it. Is that right?
Yeah. In general,
So-
yes.
We can prove. So, you see this alpha is some other polynomial.
Yes.
And we know what the alpha should be in general, but we don't know how to prove it in general. Is that
Yes.
correct, Asif?
Yes. You're right.
So it's actually a very interesting question. We know the answer, but we don't know. So what is the answer we're talking about? The answer we're talking about is, this zeta function of the downstairs thing divides the zeta function of the upstairs thing. Okay. So the zeta function of the upstairs is zeta function inverse. Okay, please, zeta function inverse downstairs divides zeta function inverse upstairs. Therefore, zeta function inverse upstairs is zeta function inverse downstairs into some polynomial. Okay, given any graph, Asif has a conjecture of what the alpha should be, what that remainder term should be, the other factor. Okay, it's quite an interesting other factor also, but we don't really know how to prove that is true. All the examples that Professor Sheikh has seen, that answer is correct. That of course doesn't give you a proof. So this itself is, the question here is, what is that alpha? So this is a lot of time was spent on it, and I don't think we got any idea of how to prove it, in spite of playing around with it for quite some time. Anyway, so that's another thing. So there are, so this is for the Ihara-Bar zeta function. There are corresponding results about factorization. So this is a zeta function. There's something which is called the L function. Okay, it has to do with representations of the fundamental group, whatever. So there's a Artin-Ihara L function. There are, what should one say? Divisibility properties about the Artin-Ihara L functions. And therefore it gets connected with all kinds of representation theoretic ideas of what the groups are and things like that. And there are, a lot of very interesting questions that are still going on. So there's a Galois theory of graphs and the fundamental theorem of Galois theory for graphs. There's a fundamental theorem. There's a very nicely written book by Audrey Terrace called Zeta Functions on Graphs. So please have a look at this. And there are connections of these zeta functions with what are called Ramanujan graphs. Okay, and there's a Riemann hypothesis for graphs. And the statement of the theorem is that a graph satisfies the graph Riemann hypothesis if and only if the graph is a Ramanujan graph. So this circle of ideas actually encompasses, very large parts of mathematics. It's 3:45 and I should stop here. So I hope this doesn't come into Professor Solapurkar's, you start at 12 and end at 12:58. It's exactly 3:45. I'm stopping exactly at the time I'm supposed to stop. Okay, so there's a lot of things that are going on here. There are a lot of connections with practically all of mathematics. And it's actually very interesting. Now, I think tomorrow, Professor Sheikh will tell you some extensions of this in, not quite extensions, but some, again, a similar set of ideas. So in fact, these ideas starting from yesterday's talk, or day before yesterday's talk by Professor Nimborkar, and this talk and the next two talks by Professor Sheikh are sort of all related to each other in a certain way. It's very much related to graph theory, and the point is that it is also very much related to practically every other branch of mathematics, and recently even quite a few parts of physics, theoretical physics. Okay, I should stop here. Any questions? Please feel free to ask. I have sent this, I believe you already have these notes, and you please have a look at the notes. If you have any questions, you can of course ask. And, I hope you get interested in this. There are very beautiful pictures that come up, and very beautiful pictures of, these graphs that one is coming up and talking about zeta functions and covering spaces and all kinds of things. Yeah.
What is the most efficient way of computing these zeta functions? So if you are given a graph, you want to compute.
Computing is a determinant. Computation is easy. The right-hand side is easy. It's a determinant.
But if it's a reasonably large graph, then you will need some package or some. You can't do it by hand.
Yeah,
right?
The point is that it is as
you want to experiment. Let us say you want to experiment. You want to calculate for several classes of graphs. You want to calculate these zeta functions. So how do you? So is there any package or what's the most efficient way of
one of these packages that you've been learning so far? You should come and teach me, okay? Because I don't know that. We have been doing things. I don't know if Professor Sheikh has learned these packages and how to generate these graphs, and we did it the old-fashioned way by hand and paper of calculating these things.
The old are gold.
So it is very old. The point is that what is that extra factor alpha? We know what alpha is, but we cannot prove it. All the examples we have, we know what the alpha is. What is that remaining divisor of that downstairs with respect to upstairs? Okay, but as you say, one has to use some package and get so many examples that will tell you what is. I don't know the answer to that. What is the package that you would use? Okay.
So this expression that you have for the zeta function in terms of this I minus W1U determinant of this.
Yeah.
I don't know if it can be use it to actually compute the zeta function.
No, it's as difficult.
This looks like characteristic
polynomial,
but not quite.
Calculating this, okay, A is the adjacency matrix. So your question is, can you calculate the adjacency matrix of a graph? Of course you can. Okay. Q is the degree of the matrices -1. Okay. So Q is easy to calculate. So that expression Ix minus AXU plus QU squared, that is just a n by n matrix. N is the number of vertices. The question is, can you calculate the determinant? Okay. Yeah. It's an n by n matrix with integer entries, and most of the entries are 0. Okay. If you have a sparse matrix, most of the adjacency matrices of graphs that you come across, when they're very large graphs, the A is very sparse. There are very few ones, and most of the entries are zeros. So this is a 0-1 matrix. A is a 0-1 matrix. Most of the entries are 0. Okay, even if the matrix is very large. Q is an diagonal integer matrix. Okay. Q is diagonal. So this matrix is not very complicated if you know the graph. Okay, the matrix can be very large, but it is a very sparse matrix with mainly 0 entries. Can you do it? Okay, so the question is that which is the correct software to use? Okay, so I don't know the answer to your question, but you have been learning about all these softwares, and it will be very interesting to see how you use that. Okay.
Okay.
Anything else? And by the way, as I said, these two theorems that Krishnan had talked about yesterday follow from this formula. Okay. About the Q determinant of a tree.
Just one comment and suggestion.
Yeah.
Actually, the graphs dealing with the symmetric diagram. And orientation is symmetric diagram.
Achha, so you're saying this is some kind of symmetric diagram, and then you'll, but the question is this expression on the right? The left is this counting business, okay? Yeah. Zeta x inverse, some counting or whatever, it's an infinite product. The right side expression, okay, can you interpret that in some way for when you have a diagram or something like that? I don't know the answer.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, okay.
But the point is that it is quite, the formula itself, that Bas's proof is amazing. You should go through that Bas's proof, okay? It can be taught at the undergraduate level, okay?
Yeah, okay, okay.
But it can be taught only after it has been proved. And how did he prove it? I have no idea, okay? It's sort of,
Okay.
it's an amazing formula.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Anything else? No. Okay. So thank you for listening,
Thank you.
and we'll see you.
Yeah, thank you both.
Yeah,
Thank
thank
you.
you.
Sure.